Welcome to Produce Talks.
This whole business is based on relationship and friendships.
Food is darn simple.
What can we do? What are other countries doing?
How important it is for industry to be talking about this.
We're going back to the farm. We're going back to the whole food.
Hi, I'm Wally Burns, the Education and Training Manager at CPMA. CPMA would like to welcome Cascades Container Board as the sponsor of this podcast. Cascades offers sustainable, innovative, and value-added solutions such as packaging for fruits and vegetables. Our solutions from your farm to the table are designed to maintain the freshness and safety of your products while being customizable, recyclable, and made from recycled content. Dan Duguay is CPMA's Sustainability Specialist. In this episode, he will give an update on the regulatory proposals from Environmental and Climate Change Canada, known as ECCC. These proposals will significantly reduce plastic packaging for fresh fruit and vegetables. We will talk about CPMA and the industry's response to these proposals and report on the impact that the proposed regulations will have on the fresh produce industry in Canada. We've added a segment to each of our monthly episodes called Industry Insights. Listen to the end of the podcast as Mike Mauti shares current statistics from the Canadian consumer market. It's a short 5-minute segment that will provide you with timely updates to help in your business. Welcome to this episode of CPMA's Produce Talks. Can you tell me why packaging is so critical to the fresh fruit and vegetable supply chain?
Great question, because I think people think of packaging as just what they see in the store. And there's a phrase I've heard recently that I think really speaks to the importance, and quote unquote, is that 90% of what packaging does, it does before the consumer sees it. So I think that really speaks to the importance of packaging as not just the convenience and the ability to differentiate produce within the store, but it plays an integral role in the sustainability of the produce supply chain, literally from the point of cultivation through to the transportation, the distribution, ultimately on the store shelf, and finally at the consumer's home. This is the part of packaging that I think is being increasingly recognized as, getting packaging right is about enabling the sustainability of that global produce supply chain, which is, so integral to making sure that Canadians get fresh, healthy, safe, high quality, fresh produce year round.
So what is the produce industry doing to help improve the environmental sustainability of the packaging used to reduce plastic waste?
Again, an excellent question, because I'll start with your comment of reducing plastic waste. What has really been driving the industry for several years now is how to address the concern that a lot of packaging, be it plastic or even non-plastic packaging, ends up in landfills. So again, I start with the point, what is the problem? And the problem is that a lot of this packaging, for various reasons, ends up in landfills. And that could be because the packaging is just inherently not recyclable, for example. Or the issue could be that there's a lack of recycling infrastructure in certain parts of the country, which means that packaging, irrespective of its construction, ends up in landfill. So I start with that because what's really driving the industry is, what's the problem? And the problem is that plastic waste issue. And so what the industry has really been doing, I'd say since 2019, when it struck, at least in Canada, when the CPMA struck the packaging working group, is to look at a variety of sustainable packaging strategies to mitigate the creation of plastic waste. And currently, there are 5 sustainable packaging strategies that kind of dominate the landscape. The first is elimination, which is either flat out elimination, if at all possible, but also lightweighting. So reducing the amount of material necessary to deliver the performance required of the packaging, be it the barrier properties, the mechanical properties. So lightweight as much as possible without compromising that performance, but also innovative elimination. So this is where there's been some interest in, for example, certain types of coatings that can replace plastic packaging or plastic wrap, for example. So that would fall into the first category. That's the elimination category. The second category is reuse, which the industry has relied on quite extensively, especially when it comes to secondary and tertiary packaging. So the packaging that helps to move produce, from business to business or move it to the back of store. There's an increasing, I think, recognition, but also adoption of more reuse models in that regard. You don't see as much reuse at the primary packaging stage, where, for example, what the consumer grabs and puts in their cart and takes home. But you do see it a lot more in the back of store at the moment. The third sustainable packaging strategy is the adoption of more recyclable or fully recyclable packaging forms. So this is, for example, where historically maybe some packaging had a mix of material types, had a certain construction that really prevented it from being readily recyclable and recycled. So a lot more movement towards formats that are truly recyclable. And a lot of this guided by the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the development of Golden Design Rules, for example. The fourth sustainable packaging strategy is the incorporation of recycled content. So this is where you displace a certain percentage of the material to recycled content. And in the produce industry, we're seeing a growing focus, in fact, an investment in securing food grade recycled content and incorporating it into produce packaging. Some instances that could exceed 60, 70, even 80% recycled content in some select instances, but definitely an effort that the industry recognizes helps to, again, mitigate the use of virgin resin. And then the fifth sustainable packaging strategy is substitution. And substitution is a bit of a catch-all for things like more recyclable or recyclable non-plastic packaging. So I distinguish. It's non-plastic, but it's recyclable. So this is where looking at certain fiber applications, certain constructions that are maybe not plastic, but are recyclable could be considered. Again, as long as they provide the performance necessary for things like food safety, maximizing shelf life, etc. But you also have under substitution, for example, the consideration for compostable materials or compostable packaging. So those are sort of the five categories. And as I like to call them, that's the portfolio. That is the portfolio of sustainable packaging strategies that the produce industry has been pursuing for the last several years. And my point to close on this question is that it requires a portfolio of solutions. What works well for cucumbers will not work for bananas. What works well for bananas will not work well for berries. And what works really well for berries will not necessarily work well for apples. And so that's the challenge for the produce industry, is that there is no silver bullet. It's a portfolio of solutions that it's been pursuing to really, again, optimize that supply chain, accounting for the challenges that come with all the different produce categories and different produce varieties. So that's what the industry has been doing, I'd say, for the last several years for sure.
So the industry has been using innovation to address these 5 areas of sustainable packaging strategies, and will continue to make significant efforts to adopt more environmentally sustainable packaging. Can you tell us what the ECCC is proposing?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little interesting, because what is happening right now is that the federal government is proposing a number of regulatory actions to help address, again, the concerns around plastic waste. And presently, the government, I'd say, has 2 approaches that are of direct interest to the produce sector. The first is a set of proposed regulations around labeling and recycled content, which excludes primary food packaging. So I'll come to that in a moment, because they're proposing a different instrument for primary food packaging. But it does include a proposal to ban non-compostable plastic PLU stickers. And so this is a concern to the produce industry, of course, because of the role that price lookup or PLU stickers play in the identification and the differentiation of produce types and varieties in a store. It includes enabling the right kind of inventory control, etc. And so the banning of the plastic PLU sticker, and therefore requiring that the industry identify or work towards more compostable forms, is of concern because the technology is not there yet. The scale of availability of compostable stickers is not there yet. And to get a little technical, there is a concern that the way the government is proposing this could lead to the adoption of non-compostable, non-plastic stickers. And again, to really frame why this matters is that the produce industry has recognized and acknowledged that the challenge with PLU stickers at the moment is not one of plastic waste or plastic pollution. It is one of contamination of organics recycling facilities. In other words, when food waste goes to organic recycling or industrial composting facilities, the stickers contaminate those systems. And so the CPMA drafted and released some guidance to the industry earlier this year to help the industry develop plans for transitioning to compostable PLU stickers, irrespective of their construction. So, sorry, that's a long answer to the question of what's the government doing. The government is proposing to ban non-compostable PLUs, non-compostable plastic PLUs. And so we continue to argue that the industry is already working towards solutions that are, again, in response to the concern from the organics recycling industry. The second thing that the government is considering is the application of what's called a pollution prevention plan for primary food packaging. The pollution prevention plan is what I'll call quasi-regulatory instrument. It's not a formal regulation, but it is an instrument that is under the auspices of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act that can be used to address concerns around certain pollutants. It has been used successfully in a number of instances with very specific substances of concern. Think of mercury used in the dental industry as an example, is where that type of tool has been successful. The government is proposing to use that tool to address concerns around plastic waste arising from primary food packaging. So this is a very ambitious initiative we consider because it applies to all primary food packaging in store. In other words, they would be requiring the major grocers in Canada to develop these pollution prevention plans to achieve to be defined targets within store by a certain period of time. And we're not sure that that's actually doable under the pollution prevention plan, given the broad scope of primary food packaging in store. One point I do want to point out is for produce, there is a concern around this approach because the government is proposing a target. The term used in a pollution prevention plan is a risk management objective that 95% of all produce would be sold in bulk or in plastic-free packaging by 2028. This is a target which is of serious concern for the industry because it is largely unachievable and clearly does not reflect the realities, again, of the global supply chain that provides fresh fruits and vegetables to Canadians year-round. So those are the two efforts, again, the banning of the non-compostable plastic PLU and the application of the pollution prevention plan for primary food packaging, which includes this proposed target of 95% bulk or plastic-free produce by 2028.
How has CPMA and the industry responded to these proposed regulations, Dan?
We've responded, I would say, quite actively since, definitely since the consultation on the PLU in the spring and the consultation on the pollution prevention plan in August of this year. An extensive set of responses to the government on these proposals, outlining the number of concerns, the issues we have regarding things like food affordability, food availability, food safety, food loss, etc. So this has been quite extensively communicated both to officials as part of the formal response, as well as ongoing engagement and advocacy with officials in the Environment Department, but also in other departments federally for whom these impact would matter: Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, Health Canada, et cetera. We've also engaged, I'd say, quite actively at the political level, again, to draw attention to the concerns, the serious concerns the industry has of this approach and the adverse impacts it would have on the produce industry and the availability and cost of produce to Canadians. I'd say that's been a big part of our work. The other thing that we've been doing is definitely some research to more effectively qualify and quantify the effects that these proposed regulations would have. Just to point out that, these are targets that are just not that they're difficult, they're just not even feasible in the context of the way that the current global produce supply chain works. So we've been doing a lot of work, working very closely with our members who have a lot of, successes and use cases to show what does work, but also relying on some credible third parties to do more of the quantitative analysis so that we can basically make the case that this is not the right approach and that the right approach is to work more closely with the industry to identify the activities that have been proven to work and help support and advance, some of the other work that it needs to do to further address any of the concerns around plastic waste arising from produce packaging.
Can you give us an example, Dan, of what this would mean for the average consumer in the grocery store?
It's a little early to answer this question because we're finalizing some studies that in fact are aiming to quantify that effect in a fairly accurate way. But I would say based on what we've seen to date in terms of the analysis and the interviews that we've done to really try to quantify this effect, we're easily talking about double-digit increases in food cost. The ramifications of effectively eliminating the use of plastic, again, in many, many cases, recyclable plastic in fresh produce packaging means significant investments in retooling and capital investment, increased cost in the materials and the packaging that is in some cases very novel or not available at scale. And then there's also the added concern of any increases in produce loss in transit, in other words, shrink, as well as impacts regarding reductions in shelf life. You combine all that together, what it basically does is it drives the cost of food up and it drops the availability. So right now, double digits increases in food costs and definitely double digit losses in food availability is where the research and the analysis is currently pointing towards. And our goal is to have that work really completed, I'd say, over the next couple of weeks, probably the next month, at which point, we will use that to further highlight the challenges and the risks that come with the government's proposed approach, but then reinforce the need to work more closely with the produce industry and identify those solutions, again, plural, the portfolio of solutions that the industry has been developing to increasingly address the issues, concerns around plastic waste.
So these proposals could lead to an increase in inflation, increase in food waste. Can you tell us more about what the industry can do at this point?
I'd say that at this point, what's important is to showcase what the industry has been doing. So I come back to the 5 sustainability strategies. We have very good examples of what the industry has done in terms of lightweighting, innovative elimination, increased reuse models, increased recyclability, increased recycled content, and in some cases, substitution to compostable solutions or other solutions. The example there being the PLU sticker, the work towards more compostable forms of PLU stickers. It's that portfolio that the industry needs to showcase better, needs to highlight its respective efforts, and really, again, draw attention to the fact that the challenge for produce is getting that portfolio right, getting that right mix of packaging solutions and technologies that can drive the overall creation of plastic waste down for produce. I said at the beginning, there is no silver bullet for produce. There's such a diversity across the various produce categories and varieties that you have to have almost customized solutions for various, groups of produce. It's the showcasing of what those solutions are, and ultimately to highlight that in some cases, the problem may not lie with the packaging itself, but may lie with the state of the waste management system in various parts of the country. And so anecdotally, what is interesting is that there's parts of the country that have very well developed, established recycling capabilities, and other parts of the country less so. Even in some states in the United States, recycling is totally absent, for example. So what that means is you may have a packaging which is completely recyclable, and in fact is an ideal material for recycling because of its composition. But because of a lack of waste management best practices, or possibly even a complete absence, you have a problem or challenge in that packaging is going to go to landfill. The problem is the lack of recycling infrastructure or proper waste management, not so much that the packaging isn't recyclable. And so this is an important and always important part of our discussions, is to eliminate the packaging because there's no recycling capacity means that you have to be ready to accept the trade-offs, which may again involve food affordability, food availability, food loss increases, et cetera. So that's, I'd say, what the industry can help do over the next little while, is help communicate those are the impacts that are of concern. And that ultimately what the produce industry is really quite good at is that balancing act. It's making packaging decisions that, again, deliver affordable food, safe food, minimize food loss, maximize availability year-round for Canadians, and minimize packaging waste that goes to landfills. So that's what I think the industry does and needs to probably communicate a little better, but definitely showcase that it's doing that across a very broad array of produce types. And we have a lot of good examples of how that's being done and how it's getting better every day.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot of useful information to this complex topic. We look forward to seeing the reports that CPMA will be releasing in the coming months to address these issues. CPMA has made a significant effort to get to know the Canadian produce consumer better. As a result of these efforts, we have new data about what consumers' preferences are and their purchasing habits, and how they're affected by things like inflation. We've added a new segment to our podcast series called Industry Insights. Each month, we'll hear from experts like Mike Mauti, CPMA's own consumer guru, who will provide our listeners with just a taste of what we've learned about the Canadian consumers this month. So welcome, Mike. We're always very interested to hear what the Canadian produce consumer has to say. What can you tell us about today?
Well, thank you again, Wally. It's always a pleasure to be here. And today we're going to take another look at inflation. And this time we've asked our panel, when do they think these inflationary times are going to end? And then we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about quality as a driver of repeat produce purchases. Again, we've talked a lot about price being a driver, and a couple sessions ago, we even talked about taste being a driver. But we're going to take a look at quality and see how that's impacting people's decisions to repurchase produce products.
It will be interesting to hear what the Canadian consumers think about inflation. We've heard that the federal government, along with the major grocery retailers, have a plan to curb inflation. Do Canadians really expect this will usher in a quick end to high prices?
Well, the short answer to that, Wally, is some do, some don't, and some are extremely skeptical. It works out quite interestingly that a similar number of people believe that inflation is going to end sometime in 2024. And as we go through the year, we find that more people are thinking that this will be the time when it ends. For example, only 4% of the panel believes that we're going to see an end to inflation early in 2024. 12% think it's going to happen sometime in the middle of the year. whereas 14% think it's going to happen sometime towards the end of the year. So in total, we're looking at about 30% of the panel thinking that we're going to see an end to this inflation sometime next year. But then there are those who are a little bit more skeptical. In fact, 23% think that it's going to end sometime in 2025. And then a further 21% think that it could extend through 2026 and maybe even beyond. It should be noted, though, that there are a significant chunk of grocery shoppers out there who just don't know. And we're seeing that about a quarter of the panel is saying they're not sure when inflation is going to end. But we see 30% saying next year, 23% saying in 2025, and then 21% or a fifth of the panel saying 2026 and beyond. But again, just like everything else, we do see that there are some differences when we take a look at different demographics. And for one, we see that the male portion of the panel are a little bit more optimistic that we're going to see a quick end to the inflationary times. We're seeing about 37%, almost 2 out of 5 males are saying that, yes, it's going to end sometime next year. And we're seeing only 23% or slightly less than a quarter of the females saying the same thing. The younger cohorts are also a little bit more optimistic about the end of the inflation. About a third of the 20 to 34-year-olds are saying sometime next year versus less than a quarter of the 65 plus. So you do see some changes with respect to the different generations. And we also see that across the country, people have different opinions. If you look at the Atlantic region, under 20% are thinking that next year will be the end of inflation, whereas over a third of the population in the West are saying the same thing. And what's really interesting is depending on where you shop is also driving different opinions. Club shoppers are more likely to think that inflation is going to end next year relative to some of the other formats.
I guess if they think high prices will be around for some time longer, this is why quality is an important purchase drive. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've been focusing so much on price, and price being a roadblock to purchases, and low price being an important driver to purchases. But we're seeing that quality is growing in importance when it comes to being the deciding factor on whether someone is going to purchase a produce item again. So if we look way back to before these inflationary times, and it's kind of hard to pin it on one specific time, but if we look at sometime in the fourth quarter of 2021, that's a kind of a good stake in the ground to say that was pre-inflation. Only 56% of our panel was saying that quality will generate a repurchase. I say only 56% because I'm comparing that to the most recent bit of data we have that says 66% of the panel is saying that quality is driving a repeat purchase. A 10% gap over the period of a couple of years. So it's a pretty significant increase. And again, we're seeing that it's being felt differently depending on your demographics. Males are gravitating towards quality more so than females. And we also see that, again, depending on where you shop, quality is going to be driving that repeat purchase a little bit differently. Those who are shopping in club stores or conventional grocery store formats are more apt to rely on quality to dictate a repurchase than are those in shopping in the discount stores or mass merchants.
So it does sound like some people are adapting by looking for quality at the grocery stores. Thanks for the update. We look forward to hearing more from you next time.
Thanks, Wally. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Dan and Mike. And to the listeners, thank you for listening. Remember, you can subscribe to Produce Talks at Google or Apple Podcasts and on most other podcast players. Until next time, fill half your plate with fruits and veggies, continue to seek out new knowledge, and basically never stop growing.